last time we learned about the mitzvah to sanctify oneself, right? That one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is that we are supposed to make ourselves holy. And unlike the Rambam, Mayanot, who says that that's not an actual mitzvah, because a mitzvah, to be counted as one of the 613, needs to obligate us to do something distinct, something specific that we wouldn't otherwise do, right? So the commandment to keep the commandments is not itself one of the commandments. So if we were to understand being holy is achieved through observing the commandments, then it wouldn't be a distinct commandment. However, the Ramban, Nachmanides, says that there is a mitzvah to sanctify oneself in regard to what is permitted, right? Which means that when one abstains from matters, even though they are permitted, one is fulfilling a positive mitzvah. And we discussed, it doesn't therefore mean that when one does not abstain from permitted matters, one is by default sinning. And we differentiated that between that and purely, crass and crude and despicable behavior, which is itself a problem in its own right. So to make this concrete, the sages, in Talmudic times, they would delay eating breakfast for 2 hours. Well, not breakfast, their daytime meal, because they had 2 meals a day. They had the day meal and the evening meal. So which I guess was breakfast, also lunch. Anyway, they would delay it for 2 hours, right? And it's not that they were eating in some sort of indulgent manner or a crass manner, but they would delay it in order to bring a offering to God of sacrifice and inclination, and through that fulfilling this mitzvah. But one could not say that if they would eat at the regular time, they would somehow be sinning, right? In contrast, if you were forcing food down your throat because it tastes good, but your body is saying, "Oh, please do not put any more in; it's too much," then you are actually violating the Torah law. Not okay thing to do. Note for eating the afikomen.
Yeah, but you have to.
You have to eat the afikomen how?
Like a certain amount.
You do, right?
Well, what if you can't?
Well, then that's why you shouldn't eat too much during the meal. It says you're supposed to eat the afikomen al haseiva. Al haseiva means once one is satiated. You know what satiation is? Satiation is when you decide to stop eating. Like really, you decide to stop eating and move on. You wouldn't be hungry until the next meal time. So I think the Rambam says about 2/3 of your stomach being full. You know when you feel full, you're way up past satiation. It's very hard to tell that you're satiated when you know what you're eating, because your appetite is on. When you're in the middle of eating, it is very hard to tell that you are satiated, because your appetite is on. That's why all the health experts say that you should eat your food slowly. And after you've eaten what you set out to eat, you should wait, pause before you decide to have seconds. Because it's actually, you have to feel in the body that actually there's no more hunger anymore. But for most of us, we've finished 5 helpings of the abundant amount of food God has given us in the modern world before you even consider whether we've had enough to eat. So anyway. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the mitzvah of sanctifying oneself as it's conceived by the Alter Rebbe, and that's going to be different than the Ramban. So while they both share the view that there is such a mitzvah, the way the Ramban puts it is different. He puts it from the verse Kadeshim Tiyu, be holy, and the Alter Rebbe is bringing this commandment from a separate verse, Viskadishtem, which means make yourselves holy or sanctify yourself. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. So, fine. Let's go to the beginning of the paragraph. This is on the second to last page. This is also what the rabbis meant. If a man consecrates himself in a small measure down below, he is sanctified much from above. Apart from just having fulfilled the positive commandment of the Torah, sanctify yourselves and you shall be holy. By dedicating himself through, I don't know how to say that word. How do you say that word?
Abstinence?
What?
Abstinence?
That's not abstinence. There's an M in there.
Abstinence.
I was going to say abstinence, but then I looked at the actual letters, and that's not what it says. Abstemiousness. Do you know what that means? I learned a new word today. Okay. We should find out what that means, yeah? I'm going to do that right now. I never noticed. To be fair to myself, I have never actually studied Tanya in the English translation in this chapter, so let's see what it says, shall we?
Probably like abstinence, but it means
But one would imagine that if he wanted to say abstinence, he probably could have just written abstinence. And the person who translated this, did have a great command of language. Abstem.
Not self-indulgent, especially when eating and drinking.
What is it?
Not self-indulgent, especially.
Not self-indulging when.
Especially when eating and drinking.
No, this is actually interesting because I don't know this dictionary says that that it has emphasized that it's moderation and self-restraint in eating and drinking, whereas abstinence is like avoiding completely. So it's a more precise understanding, right? Okay, there we go. We've learned a new word. Okay. All right. Impermissible things. The meaning of sanctify yourselves is you shall make yourselves holy. Okay? What does that mean? That is to say that although in truth one is not holy and separated from the Sitracha, for it is at its strength and might, as is its birth in the left part, yet one subdues the impulse and sanctifies himself. Okay. So this idea of making yourself holy. Okay? So what does it mean to be holy? That is the question. So physically speaking, we need an analogy for holiness. And the reason we need an analogy for holiness is because we are very physical creatures, and when something is physical, we understand it much better. So to illustrate, we're going to take a physical example of holiness and contrast it with a physical example of purity. This will help make things clear. Okay, so we have a notion of purity. In Hebrew, that would be tahara. Okay, so what does it mean that you have pure water? Physically speaking. What would pure water be? No, physically. There's no other things in the water, it's just water, right? Pure olive oil would be? Good, yeah, okay. So far, so good? What would be pure reason? Just reason, nothing mixed in, right? Good. Okay, what could be mixed into the water? Dirt, bacteria, right? Okay, right? Minerals, right? For instance, this stuff, is this pure water? It's very tasty, but is it pure water? No. Remember in chemistry lab, you had that distilled water? The distilled water is pure water. Okay, pure olive oil. What could be mixed in the olive oil? Preservatives. Canola oil. Sure, think about it. How much, right? Because if you use a cheaper oil, mix it in, right? And you sell it for olive oil prices. That's right. So the thing is, canola oil is treated as kitnius on Pesach. Not getting into why that is, but just is. That's the way you practice Judaism nowadays for those of us who don't eat kitnius. So there was a hechsher, kosher supervision. And so the way you make olive oil is after you back in the old day, the way, I don't know if they still do this, but the way you make the olive oil is you crush the olives and then you get the olive juice, and then what you do is you let it sit, or you can use a centrifuge, you let it sit, and what happens is the oil separates, it's different density, and you pump it out. That takes time, so they put in all the oil juice, and then they use big vats, and then they close the vats, and they seal it, and the mashkiach, and locks it, and puts in a thing. And then you know that when he comes and opens it up again for them to pump out the olive oil, that's just olive oil, right? So there was this factory that they put some pipes into the vats from the bottom so they could pump in canola oil and therefore sell it more olive oil at olive oil price, kosher olive oil price is bigger cost.
What happened?
The hechsher found out, and I think that they found it afterwards because somebody thought that the oil tasted off or something, and they looked into it in the lab and realized it's not the same thing. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, we also still mix in the oil, right? Okay. Pure reason would be just reason. What could be mixed into the reason? Emotion, right? You think, man, you're being a bit emotional, so your conclusion is not purely rational. Okay. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just good. Yeah. Okay. So when we speak of something which is pure, tahor, it means there could be something else mixed in, right? What does it mean, though, when we say something is holy? So, we're going to have a physical analogy. Physical analogy for holiness is going to be light. Can you have anything mix? Yeah, light. Light. Can you mix anything with the light? Take water, mix it with other stuff, right? So you can pure water, not pure water. Can you have light and mix it with other things?
Well, it's a light, like from different light sources.
No, I'm just saying, can you take, like, say, light and smoke and mix them together into one substance? How about light and water? Light and, does it mix with other stuff? No. What about fire? Can you take some fire and mix it together with some other stuff? Actual flames. No, right? These things have an innate separateness from everything else, right? There's no notion of it being mixed together, right? So where I can speak about pure water or pure oil, right? The reason I speak about those things being pure or tahor is because I recognize that they could have something impure mixed into them, right? Something else mixed in. When I speak about something being holy, the real idea of being holy is that it is existentially apart. What does that mean? There's no notion of being mixed with anything else. So who is holy? God. God is holy. What does it mean that God is holy? Can you make something that is a little bit God and a little bit something else mixed together and create, like, if you have coffee, you put a little bit of sugar, a little bit of coffee grounds, and you extract that into the water, put some milk mixed together, and you get some coffee, cappuccino, whatever. So can God be an ingredient in something mixed in? No. Is those stuff mixed in together with God? No. God is? No, he's not pure. He's holy. He is, because water is pure because there's nothing else mixed into it. Could you mix other things into it? That which is pure could be impure. That which is pure can be mixed together with other things. And so even when it is pure, it still has this notion of not really being apart, not really being separate. If something is truly apart, if something is truly otherly, existentially, you don't need to protect it to make sure it doesn't get dirty and mixed in with other things. If I've got some pure water, I have to make sure that it stays pure. If I have light, I don't need to make sure that the light doesn't get contaminated by other stuff. It won't. Because it doesn't, for lack of words, exist in the same way, in the same state, on the same plane, if you will. Make sense? Okay.
But at the same time, we all make
All what?
We all, like, Hashem is
what?
one.
Hashem is one. He is. He is one.
And so everything.
Please get me a Rambam. Over there, those books. Let's say Mishnah Torah. Volume 1, Aleph with 1 star, please. Let us not forget our basic Judaism, right? We don't want to forget halacha in the grand scheme of learning all of the wonderful Chassidus that we do. So Hashem is one, yes? That's a mitzvah in the Torah. You know that? One of the 613 mitzvahs. Rabbi counts it as mitzvah number 2. Which I always find ironic. Also, it's the second of the 13 principles of the Rambam. What? Well, because number 1 is the existence of God. You kind of have to have the existence of God. Okay, so, just so we're clear, we're all on the same page. Elokah Zeh, this God, the one that we just discussed previously, Echad Hu, he is. Einei le shnayim v'le yeser shnayim. He is not 2, nor El Echad she'en yichud echad min achadim v'nimtzayim b'elam. But he is one with a singularity, a single unity that is not like any of the one things that exist in the world, right? So in a sense, we think of other things as one. They're not really one. They're one from a certain perspective, from a certain level of analysis. But if you analyze them differently, you'll see that they're actually many. Like echad kamin, not one like a kind, shukaylu chadim harbe, which has many individual instances. So, like cups. Cups is a kind of thing, but there are many individual cups. People. There's a kind of thing called people, and there are many individual people. Okay? Is God a kind of a thing in which there can be many instances of? No. It's not one like a body, which is divided into dimensions and parts. So can you speak about top of the body, the bottom of the body, the right of the body, the left of the body, right? The heart, the liver, the lungs. So does God have a top? Does he have a middle? Does he have an inside? Does he have an outside? Does he have a chesed part and a kavur part? Does he have a chesed part or a kavur part? Okay, thank you. Ela yichud she'en yichud echad k'maisai. Because he is a single unity, though there's no unity like this in the world. Okay, that is a halacha, matter of Jewish law. We are obligated, as the Rabbi says, I'll skip a few. Yedias davar zeh, the true knowledge of this matter, mitzvah says is a positive commandment, by the way, coming upon men and women. Shenemar, as God says, Hashem Elokeinu, God, our Lord, Hashem Echad, God is one. Okay? So, now, if I were to say that God is, we're all somehow part of God, is that consistent with what it says here? Whatever Chassidus says, right? So whatever Chassidus says has to be like contextualized, not to violate this stuff, right? Okay, good. So God, in His oneness, is by definition holy, because does He partake of? Is He part of? Are things part of Him? Or is He part of other things? No. Chassidus and Kabbalah aside, you have to figure out what all that stuff means, but it doesn't take away from that. So God is essentially holy, right? Good. Now, what does it mean for a person to be holy? That is a crazy idea, right? We should stop and appreciate the craziness of saying that a person is holy. Now, the title that is used in the Hasidic culture, and I'm just going out on the limb here of making things more controversial than they need to be because it's fun and entertaining to do that. The title that is given to a Hasidic Rebbe in the Hasidic culture, and this has been somewhat extended to other groups as well, but and it doesn't have to be necessarily one's own Rebbe. The title that is used, one of the titles that is used is Kavod. Kavod means his honorable, the honorable, yes. And what's the next word? Anyone know the next word? Kedushas is holiness. Yeah. Kavod Kedushas, right? You're saying that a person is holy. Now again, the Ramban says there's a mitzvah to be holy, right? And the Alter Rebbe is saying there's a mitzvah to make yourself holy, but you're not really holy. So we have to talk about what that means. But what does it mean for a person to be holy? So, if we look at what did the Alter Rebbe say? To be holy is to be separated from the Sitra Achra. Now, go back. Do you have to make sure that your light doesn't get contaminated? Just 1 second. Your light doesn't have to get contaminated with your dirt and with your smog, and is the light going to get... Yeah. Do you have to make sure your water doesn't get contaminated? Okay. So that which is pure needs to be protected from contamination. That which is holy does not. Right? Okay, so what would it mean if you say that somebody is holy, and it's used with that they're holy meaning they're separated from the Sitra Achra? What would that mean? If they go walking through the Sitra Achra, what would happen to them? Nothing. Would they have to protect themselves from the Sitra Achra? Why not? Because they're holy, right? They're existentially removed from it, right? They don't come into genuine contact and interaction with it. What if you are a pure person and you go wading through the Sitra Achra? You really should be very careful to make sure that you maintain your purity. Okay, so here's a wild. What would happen if a holy person were to see something that is ungodly? See something ungodly. They see someone sinning, for example. What? Okay, that's what. Maybe they wouldn't be able to see it, right? That's a legitimate thing. Maybe they just wouldn't be able to see it. Right? Maybe the holiness would prevent them from even registering that it's happening. And in fact, there were holy people that were like that. What else could happen if someone was really holy and they saw something that was ungodly? What?
Do something like crazy or violent, like stop.
Right. They may be so. They may have such a negative reaction, right, that they just can't coexist in the same space, right? That they would either themselves have to leave, or conversely, they would have to. It can't be coexistence with them, and it just can't happen. What else could the possibility be? What else? What?
Not just like not see it.
Right, it could be totally not understandable. Right, so I like to use the following analogy. Rabbi Levi's religion is famous for justifying all sorts of people's sinful behavior. Like persons like changing the wagon wheel while they're davening and things like this. So there's a way in which people think that he's being cute. But I mean, if you notice that like you come up with all sorts of crazy stories to make the world make sense to you, rather than just admit that maybe the world isn't what you thought it was. Okay, so what if your holiness made it that it just was inconceivable to you that a Jew would like consciously sin and go against God? Then what would your mind naturally do? Come up with all sorts of explanations, ways of looking at it. Right? It's not necessarily being cute. Right? And sometimes your mind just like blanks things out because it just doesn't compute. Like, how could that be, right? Or maybe you're like, can be so just utterly repulsed by it that you just can't, like, you can't coexist with it. The fifth Chabad Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, he was very anti-communist. They were anti-God and anti-Judaism. So when the communists came and took over the city of Rostov where he was, he expressed that he can no longer, he can't be in the same place as them because they can't coexist. And so what did he do? What do you think he did? What? He did? He did? He left. Where did he go? What? No. No. He left this world. No. He allowed himself to get sick and die. And when you're that kind of person, I guess you can do that.
He allowed himself to
Get sick and die.
Is that a good thing also? What's the difference between that?
What's the difference between that and killing yourself?
It's like it's more like passive at that point.
What?
It's like passively allowing yourself to die. If you're looking back on that,
get sick and then
You're not looking to get sick.
You're really actively trying to get sick.
No. It doesn't work like that. As I said, people like that can do that. I didn't say like, he didn't go and do. He didn't like go do something to make himself sick.
He just got.
One of the things that is true about a person as they become closer to God is that they are a much more willing participant in everything that happens to them. And a corollary to that is God does a lot less pushing and pressuring. So a person whose body is falling apart but is that close to God and still sees that he has place in this world and what to do in this world and doesn't want to die, God will make sure that the sickness stays abated. And when the person is ready, I'm like, I've had enough, I've finished what I need to do here, I'm ready to go, then God will allow the sickness to take over, right? Most of us don't have that kind of intimate relationship with God.
How can a person decide if they're done or not?
I don't know. Well, I don't know, but I will tell you one thing, right? The more we're concerned about our physical lives, and the less we're concerned about our relationship with God and why we're here, the less qualified we are to make that decision. And given that, I'm not qualified to make that decision, and probably you aren't either. But the point is that there's this idea that there's this incompatibility between the holy and what it's separated from, and that can express itself in all sorts of different ways, right? Notice it's not universal the way it is, but what that means is a lot of how we conceive of life just wouldn't apply to a person who's holy, right? The basic notion of having to protect yourself and guard yourself lest you become corrupted, contaminated, right? That wouldn't exist for that person. Now, you could be holy for one thing and not holy in one sense and not holy in another sense, right? For instance, okay? A person might look and say something like actual full out idolatry, and like when it comes to that, actually have a kind of holiness to them that they would never do it. They're not tempted. It's totally abhorrent. It just doesn't make sense to them, right? But it doesn't mean they're a holy person writ large. Okay. Is our godly soul holy? You sure? You know how? Yeah. What does it say? What do we say in the morning when we wake up? Elokai. What does Elokai mean? Close. It means my God. My God. Period, by the way. It's important that you say put a period there because the next word is neshama, soul, and your soul is not God. Elokai, my God. Neshama shenasatabi, the soul that you have given to me. Tahira, it's still pure. Despite everything I did yesterday,
So
it's
pure
still
can't-
pure.
talking about the godly soul?
Yep.
But I thought the godly soul doesn't mix with the end. Like, it doesn't
Well, it
mix.
does. It does.
But I
No, it
thought-
definitely does.
I thought
In
the
fact,
godly
wait a second. In fact. I can't find it right now. The Alter Rebbe says that explicitly later on. Yes. The same way the soul fuses with the body, the godly soul fuses with the animal soul. And by the way, are all levels of the godly soul pure?
No.
No.
Because
After all, do
the
we speak?
highest level should be holy.
It should be, but it isn't. It's such a shame.
But it's one. It's like almost. It's like yechid.
It says, "Neshama shenasata be the soul you placed in me."
Then the neshama. There's a neshama.
Okay, yeah, that's true. The part that's in you is not holy. But how do you get the part in you to be holy? By the way, anyone know? Well, that's going to be chapter 35.
Okay, we're not gonna make that.
Okay, I'll give you a hint. God is holy, and His Torah mitzvahs are a radiation, extension, expression of His holiness. And so, if you're doing Torah mitzvahs, one can become holy.
Is it Torah not holy?
What?
Is it Torah pure?
Torah is holy. Yeah. It says that's why God compares it to fire. God's compared to fire, and the Torah is compared to fire. Which
And also.
also water for different reasons. It's compared to water for different reasons. It's compared to fire because does fire ever become impure? Yeah. So the Torah speaks about the most vile, disgusting, horrific aspects of human existence. Is that pure? Is it become like disgusting and bad? Right? So if you open up the Talmud is discussing the most debased aspects of human existence, right? Before you discuss those things, you have to make a blessing on the Torah because it's holy Torah. On the other hand, if you as a person engage in such things, it's very, very evil. Okay, so the Torah has this quality of always being holy. And this is the quality of always being holy, right? They don't become contaminated. But the soul is not like that. Right?
And also.
Again, there is an idea of the deep essence of the soul which always remains transcendent and comes out. I'm not talking about that, right? But the soul in the body, some aspect of it remains pure, and some aspect it's corrupted. But even the part that remains pure is described as pure, right? It's
If our soul isn't holy, it can't even remain pure. What does it mean that we as people are? How can commandments be holy?
How can commandments be holy?
No, I'm saying if our soul
Mm-hmm.
can't even, like the things out of us, can't even fully stay pure, not even holy, can't even fully stay pure, how are we as people expected to be holy?
Well, let's read the text again. Meaning of sanctify yourself is you shall make yourselves holy. That is to say, although in truth one is not holy, yet one subdues the impulse and sanctifies himself. Okay. What I want to differentiate is two things. There is a person being holy in as much as the Torah mitzvahs make someone holy. And that idea, like I said, we discussed in chapter 35. And that can make the godly soul move from the level of pure to the level of holy. That's wonderful. However, a person is not just a godly soul. A person is also the animal soul. And the animal soul, aside from the fact that it's not pure, it actually has very strong attachments to the sitracha, to that which is ungodly. So now, when we say that somebody is holy, right, we're saying actually, right, so in other words, like this, if you are studying Torah and you're doing mitzvahs, right, I can say there's some part of you which is ascended to holiness, there's some holiness present. But you as a human being cannot be described as holy because you as a human being are very much have an attachment to that which is ungodly, right? Your whole sense of yourself, your whole sense of how you experience reality, etc., right? So what it would mean to be holy would mean as a human being, right, that level of apartness, right, that existential distance from everything else, that incompatibility with the ungodly characterizes who you are as a human being. Now, is that a common thing for most people? No. Okay. In the language of Chassidus, that would describe a tzaddik, right? A tzaddik whose animal soul has been transformed such that it no longer has any sort of feelings or desires or attachments to anything ungodly. So, remember we discussed a few different options of what happens if a person is holy? Okay. So now, if you saw someone eating something that wasn't food, what would your reaction be? Well, depending on what it is, it might be disgust, right? It might be total bewilderment. You might engage in some sort of rationalization, like maybe they're deprived of a nutrient. Like, it would just be very hard for you to just like, yeah, of course they're eating non-food. It wouldn't compute. Something about it would just be off because your basic sense of reality is people eat food, they don't eat non-food, yes? So that's basically, those kinds of options would reflect on how such a holy person would look at people doing ungodly things. Okay. Good? Now, this is the Alter Rebbe's point. If you moderate your engagement with the ungodly things, eating, sleeping, going to work, whatever, yeah? And you even abstain a little bit here and there to sacrifice something to God, does that transform you into a holy person? That's the question, does it? Do you think it would? I mean, just think about this, right? Do you think that if you abstain a little bit from saying a joke now and then, not having the third, brownie or whatever types of, we spoke about in previous classes, I gave scoffers, so does that mean that if you do enough of that, all of a sudden one day you're going to wake up and you're totally detached and totally transcendent and aloof and disconnected from all of the ungodly things in life? Does that sound reasonable to you? Yeah. Okay. And that's why the Alter Rebbe doesn't understand there's a mitzvah to be holy, which is a state of being. He says there's a mitzvah to make yourself holy, meaning to act. Would a holy person eat something just because it tastes good? Would a holy person say a joke just because it's funny? Would a holy person do anything just because of how it makes a person feel if it didn't actually service the revelation of God's presence in the world? Okay, so what is the mitzvah to make yourself holy? Is to act that way. But you are acting that way despite the fact that you're not actually that way, right? That's what he says, right? You make yourself, that is to say, although in truth one is not holy, for the Sidracha is that it's strength and might, just like when the person was born, yet one subdues the evil and sanctifies himself, right? So he understands this mitzvah as a behavioral mitzvah, whereas the verse that the Ramban used it from almost describes it as a mitzvah where there's a state of being you're trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve a state of holiness. And by the way, people do this, right? Is it the case that people sometimes think that if they abstain from something, that somehow point eventually grow out of it and not feel like, people have that, right? And what is the Alter Rebbe indicating? That at least when it comes to the basic question of godly versus ungodly things, right? You can't withhold yourself and abstain and moderate your way out of it. All you can do is act like you are holy. Okay. Now, here's the brutal honesty part. We like to be authentic. Yes? What does it mean to be authentic? To be real. To true to yourself. Okay, so if I'm not holy and I'm going to be authentic, then what? I really do like the chocolate fudge sundae, and I really do want to eat it just because it tastes good. And I'm going to be authentic, so therefore, what should I do? I should indulge myself. So is the Alter Rebbe understanding this is a mitzvah to not be authentic? Well, again. That is to say, although in truth one is not holy and separated from the Sidracha, for it is strength and it might just as one was born, yet one subdues his evil impulse and sanctifies himself. So you are acting in a way that is contrary to who you truly are. Now, if I tell you that even though you're one way, act differently, isn't that the basic notion of what is to be not authentic? So is the Alter Rebbe telling us to be not authentic?
Yes.
You're saying yes. I'm inclined to say yes. It's simple reading of the text. What are you? And you're inclined to say no. I want to know what.
It depends on what you view as truly yourself. You say, like, if you are at your core. And then, like, if it is, then you are being true to yourself. And if that's not, you are at your core, then, like,
Okay. What do you mean who you are true at your core? Like truly deep down you really are holy?
maybe you're not holy, but you can view yourself, or at least want to identify yourself as more than just, I want to get something.
You can act and do.
Right. So this is what I want to get to. I want to differentiate between three things. There's acting, there's being, so doing and being. Now, if I only have doing and being on the table, right, those are only two ingredients, okay? So the Alter Rebbe says, this person is not holy, right? So on the level of being, they're not holy. And then the Alter Rebbe is saying, but on the level of doing, you should act holy. Well, so then my doing is inconsistent with my being, right? That sounds not authentic, right?
If we're not actually holy, that's
Right.
the core.
So what could I add? What other thing could I add into the mix that would make it authentic? And the other thing, what? So the other thing is that I want to add here is value. Right? There's being, there's valuing, and there's doing. So for instance, let's use a simple example, right? I might be jealous, right? But I might value not being jealous, right? So now there's two things in me that are in tension. There's how I am and what I value. And now the question is, which one should dictate my actions? Should my actions follow from how I am, or my actions should follow from what I value? But what's important to understand here is what you value is not the same thing as what you are. Do we value to grow and change? Think about it, right? That's why you think that, right? We value, right? If we value, right? The very notion of valuing takes us out of the static. This is the way I am, right? So this is why I think it's a little bit misleading, and I think psychologically detrimental. If a person were to say, I am not holy, but deep down I really am holy. And I'll tell you why I think it's detrimental, right? That deep down part of you, let's even say it really exists. But it's pretty deep. How deep is it? Have you felt that part? Have you felt the part of you that is totally, separated and disconnected from all of those things? Okay. On the other hand, when we talk about our values, do we actually have some real sense that we value things, that things are important to us? Because I don't have to believe in something about myself that I've never experienced. I can actually say, you know what? I'm a very jealous person. But the more I think about what it is to be jealous, the more I think about I don't want to be jealous. I value what I see, the mode of being where I see non-jealousy, right? So I can value something without being with it. And therefore I have two parts of it that are like readily available. And now the question is, how should I organize my life? Should I let the way I am limit what I value? Should what I value change my behavior and free myself of what I am? But if I say there's a part of me that really deep down is this way, and I've never met that part, never believed that part, and there's certain things I have to kind of keep telling myself a story, and that story is in the face of the lived experience of not being holy, right? Go back to the chocolate sundae, like, if you put a chocolate fudge sundae in front of me, like I do like the chocolate fudge sundae, right? Now, is there a part of me that likes other things that, sure, there's a part of me that likes things that come from expensive chocolate fudge. Sure, like I like learning, I like chocolate fudge sundaes, I like all sorts of things. I can't have all at once. But that doesn't mean I'm holy. Holy would mean that it doesn't speak to me at all. And it does speak to me. So I can say there's a deep part of me that doesn't speak to me, but I've never met that part of myself.
So in terms of the module that you gave, like the last question, like your animal soul and the little child, and then the priorities, like how you choose its priorities. So like when it's like, oh, that's the song for Sunday, you're like, the longer you say no, or like 26 seconds, the longer you're saying that you're not my priority. So So you're not prioritizing. You're prioritizing your values over
The kind of being you are. The kind of being you are. What kind of a being are you? Are you the kind of being that feels drawn to chocolate fudge sundaes, let's say? You are. Okay. But is that something I value more than my relationship with God? No. And therefore, I'm going to act one way, even though, I can even value the idea of holiness, right? That I can't be holy. I don't know how to be holy. But if I value it, I can at least, act it out to some part. Right? If you're a very jealous person, but you value not being jealous, can you at least act not jealous? Can you talk to people in a way that's not expressing jealousy? Can you treat people in a way that doesn't show jealousy? Sure, you could. What?
it's like a bit of a
I'm just kind of confused, like, how people judge, like, what's, like, obviously there's guidelines, people know what's right and wrong, but, like, how does one thing, like, how does not doing one, like, what's the scale of holiness is more?
Okay, well, that's actually one of the reasons why I want to talk about this, because from this perspective, if it's about values, right, then immediately what happens is it becomes relative to yourself. But if you say there's a part of me that's just inherently holy, inherently transcendent and removed from all of the stuff, and I'm trying to anchor my decisions in that, then you run into the problem that you have no anchor point, you have no guideline. You don't implement that part of yourself. And if you take it to the extreme, right, then you can start abstaining and restraining from all sorts of things that are not constructive and not helpful. So you have to ask yourself honestly, like what value do I see in it?
Yeah.
Right? And so what in there is that you're going to find is that there's a certain amount of gray area, right? Where, this is clearly beneath my values. This is clearly something that just seems like, beyond completely, I could...
Yeah, but also, like, if you're saying that, like, a measure of holiness is, like, not talking about people or, like, being jealous, and, like, another example you use is, like, eating chocolate cake or something, like, there's a big difference between talking about people and eating chocolate.
Right, but here the issue is not morality.
Yeah.
It's very important. Here the issue is to what degree am I attached to something other than God?
Okay.
So in that sense, chocolate cake is just as much as good as anything else. Nothing bad about the chocolate cake per se.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, okay, if I value this idea of not being attached to anything other than God, well, to the degree that I value that, I can act out my values to some degree.
Okay.
But it has to be my value, right? You understand the difference? Like, in my experience, when a person makes it a battle between something that is true about me that I don't really relate to, it's just like a story, versus something I actually experience, there's no way of like grounding that in some early sense of proportionality. There's no way of coming into some sort of like harmonious sense of being okay with myself. But if a person says, okay, I really do value this idea of not being attached to things other than God, but I am attached to things other than God, okay. And there's nothing I can do about that, but I can make decisions to act out my values and my behavior, which is consistent along the whole theme of Tanya, right? That's the whole kind of Beinoni mindset. The Beinoni mindset is about what? Is about prioritizing acting out one's values, right? Rather than worrying about the kind of person you are. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And this goes back to what we were saying in the previous class. This is why you really need to have an openness to God, right? Because if you just set it as some sort of external standard, like, if you take this to the extreme, like everything that isn't like an explicit Torah mitzvah is in some sense not godly, and then what are you supposed to do? Like totally abstain from life?
Yeah.
You have no, right? A real holy person doesn't have that problem because they have a sense of being holy. But if you're not really a holy person, then you have to anchor it in your sense of your value for holiness, which has to be yours. Good?
But where do we get that value from?
Ah, that is a very good question. That value we get from our godly soul through engaging with the different aspects of Judaism that help us become more aware of the godly soul's perspective. So this would be, obviously, to the degree to which one lives a life of Torah mitzvahs is going to be important, because the godly soul should be healthy. But then specifically, it's through reflecting upon the truth of God and His greatness and His unity. And the godly soul gives us the ability to have some sense of that, the significance of that. And then in light of that, we recognize that there's something unbecoming and inappropriate of being attached to things other than God. And it's the degree we have a sense of that is the degree then that we feel like we should be holy. And then we feel we should be holy, but even though we're not holy, then we can act it out.
Then we do have the sense of holiness in us.
A sense of, we'll go back to what I used of jealousy. You can have a sense of how it is good and not to be a jealous person. It doesn't mean that you're not a jealous person. A sense of something is not the same thing as being that thing. Right? And that's the very notion of aspirations. We value things above and beyond where we actually are, or even necessarily what we could become. Yeah.
It just sounds very negative to me. Like maybe I'm not understanding, but to call ourselves not holy at our core, and to like, I don't know. It's like so like growing up. It just like I thought like we're supposed to not supposed to like look down on ourselves like that.
We're not supposed to look down, and we're not supposed to look up. We're supposed to look exactly the way things are. So it's a very simple question, right? No judgment, and put all the judgment aside. It's not about judgment. It's just about like an honest assessment, right? Okay. Does God, in as much as we're going to anthropomorphize it, okay, so I'm not worried about describing God being emotional right now. Does God's day get better when the lunch tastes better? In any way, shape, or form? Is God's day worse when the lunch is not as tasty? Or does that just seem ridiculous? Okay, now, as you, is your day conceivably better? I'm not even asking you, is it? I'm just saying, is it conceivable to you that your day would get better because lunch was tastier and your day would get worse? Okay, so are you holy? You're a kind of person. Okay, but again, I don't mean this as a judgment. I'm not using holy as a synonym for good. I'm not using holy as a synonym for God loves you, right?
So is it different than how holiness is described in other places?
In Chassidus, no.
This is the definition.
Well, so again, this is not different than the way it's used in other places, although it's being used slightly differently because we're doing it in the context of Chassidus. But this meaning of holy and separateness, it is the way it's used. Now, I can use it in other contexts as well, but we're not in this. So if you want to give an example. So for instance, let's use two examples. One is Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. What is the sanctification of the name? No Kabbalah, no mysticism, just simple use. I want you to see how the word is being used in the same way, but when you put it in a different context, it takes on a different meaning, which is the way the words are, right? Say big, and I mean ideas is different than big when I'm talking about mountains. There's a notion of bigness, but okay. What does it mean to sanctify God's name?
Like you do something correct, and like you're representing Hashem.
Okay, you are representing Hashem. That's not the mitzvah of sanctifying His name. That because you're representing Hashem, so His name's attached to you, right? So you've got this, belongs to God, God incorporated, stamped on you. Okay, so you've got God's logo on you. Okay, so what is that? What is the acting appropriately? How important is God? Most important? Most important, or like nothing is even in comparison? If you have God on one side, does anything else get to go on the scale? No. Okay, good, right? That's holy, right? There's like when we put God in the equation, like everything else becomes irrelevant, yes? What is the most important value in Judaism that we always take into consideration when deciding halacha? So it's an overriding consideration. Always. Shalom bayis, this is very good, more important than that. How about life and death? Pretty serious issue, yeah? Where's the one area in Judaism where we just don't care if you're going to die? Well, so with murder, it's actually not that we don't care, it's just there's a technical problem. Basically is that somebody's going to die anyway, so why should you sin if someone's going to die anyway? And then with adultery is because the Torah links that to murder, so I guess God wants to treat adultery that way. But that doesn't actually say fundamentally we don't care. There is one area where we fundamentally don't care. Idolatry. You know why? Because whose name is on the line? And actually, because of that, in principle, when any mitzvah that we have, if it's a question of violating the mitzvah and keeping our life, or the opposite, in principle, what should we be doing? We should be dying rather than transgress the mitzvah. And the only reason we don't is because God says, actually, I would like you to live. So what it means is that when you put God into the equation, everything else becomes irrelevant, even life and death. Right? God is totally, right? And because God's name, God's reputation, if you will, is attached to you, therefore, when it's a question of his significance versus anything else, the everything else becomes irrelevant, right? There's no place for anything else, right? You see this there's an absoluteness to this? Okay. Now, so the separateness has this kind of very much a negating quality. It really does, yeah? Okay, now let's take another example. Again, no mysticism. There's two areas of mitzvahs which are very weird for most modern people. And they are kosher food and the laws about who we are allowed to have relationships with, specifically marital relations. Right? Why can't you eat pork? Why can't you eat milk and meat? Why does the animal need to be slaughtered the exact way it does? Why can't you eat blood? Why, And the rule is, so it's very interesting, the Rambam took, this is not his own innovation, this is based on the way he connects in the Torah and the when the Rambam codified Jewish law, he made 14 books. Each book is a theme. So for instance, this book is called Hamada, Sefer Hamada, the book of knowledge. And this deals with all of the kind of fundamental principles of Judaism. So you have the laws, the foundations of the Torah, the laws of proper conduct, studying Torah, laws of idolatry, laws of tshuva, getting right. Then you have the Sefer Av, the book of love, which is all the mitzvahs about loving Hashem, reciting the Shema, blessings, prayer, right? All those relationship building mitzvahs, right? Then we have Zmanim, which are all the mitzvahs of times, right? Shabbos, holidays, etc. Make sense? Okay. There's a book called the Book of Kedusha, the Book of Holiness. What are the mitzvahs in the Book of Holiness? The book of, I'm going to put this kind of bluntly, what you can eat and who you can have intimate relationships with. It's not the same thing as the laws of marriage. There's a separate book about marriage. This is about who a person is allowed to be with. And why are these go into the realm of Kedusha, of holiness? God wants us, we have God's name attached to us, right? And God wants us to be separate. And so therefore, on a very, very basic level, we have restrictions about the most basic human things, food and procreation. And we cannot just eat whatever we want, and we cannot procreate with whoever we want, because we are holy. We have God's name stamped on us.
But some of the Noahide laws also have to
The Noahide laws specifically relate to what we'll call unnatural types of relationships, where the Jewish ones go far beyond that. Okay. And even within Jews, okay, a Kohen is more restricted in who they can marry than a non-Kohen. Why? Because relative to everyone else, the Kohen is holy. Are we right? Okay. So there's an idea that holiness really does mean apart, separate, and therefore is negating something. Right? There is this idea. Again, negation take on many forms. So now those are in more of like the sociological context, halacha context, but you can then take that idea and put it into metaphysics, right? Saying, okay, if I, as a living creature, feel attachment, feel emotional relationship with something that isn't God, then what am I not? I'm attached to something other than God. I'm invested in something other than God. I feel my emotional life goes up and down in relation to things other than God. Then,
well, wouldn't even a tzaddik have that?
No, that's what.
So they don't feel attached to their family,
They do. Via God. This gets into a different issue. That our conception of God is rather childish. It's a separate issue. In other words, our conception of God is that God is like the invisible man upstairs. So we don't like to say that's what we believe, but at some level we do. And the invisible man upstairs, right, means that the only thing we care about is the invisible man upstairs. The invisible man upstairs isn't here, and therefore, but that's not true. So, for instance, the tzaddik, just to give you an example, does God rejoice when a husband and wife get along? Okay, so if a tzaddik is totally attached to God, does he rejoice when a husband and wife get along? And if he's the husband or she's the wife, then don't they have to get along in a genuine way for that to happen?
Yeah, so it's not even never get an argument.
Well, does God ever get into arguments?
Yes.
So would the tzaddik get into arguments?
Yeah, but then you can see like this.
That's right. In other words, unless you, that's right. Which is why you cannot specify a particular behavior or a personality trait and identify whether the person is holy. That's right. You can't do that. Inasmuch as God does relate and participate in present Himself through the whole, spiritual scheme of whatever spirits, whatever, in all sorts of different ways of being, right? So then, yeah, you have tzaddikim all different types, right? Shammai, Hillel, right? You heard of the Baal Shem Tov's grandson of Baruch Mezhebush? Baruch Mezhebush said, my grandfather showed the world how to serve God with joy. I show how you can serve God with anger. Does God get angry?
Yes.
So is there a mode of being godly and being angry? Okay. I don't know how to do that, but I also know a lot of things. Yeah. Right. So in other words, when you have a childish version of God, right, you're going to have a childish version of holiness, right?
So when he do try to make God angry?
No. he used to. So I'll tell you one story. But the rule with the story is that you're not allowed to ask questions about a story, which is what happened.
Okay.
I wasn't there. You weren't there. That's what happened.
Yeah.
So Baruch Mezhebush was known for being a very serious critic of many other Hasidic rabbis. Basically all of them. Oh yeah, he considers himself to be the true heir of the Baal Shem Tov.
Which is it still?
Mezhebush? I don't know. Baruch Mezhebush. I don't know. Anyway, so one of the tzaddikim that he had a beef with Alter Rebbe. Yeah, everybody. He really, parenthetical, not the story I was going to say, but the story goes is that after the Alter Rebbe got out of jail in Petersburg, Russia, so Nachman Breslov, who was friendly with the Alter Rebbe, and Nachman Breslov was the nephew of Baruch Mezhebush. Baruch Mezhebush did not hold Nachman Breslov at all. He was everybody.
But Rabbi Nachman was also
He was a great grandson through a daughter. So he told the Alter Rebbe jokingly is that you dealt with Peter Berg, but now you have to do with Fetter Baruch. Fetter in Yiddish means uncle. You dealt with Peter Berg, you have to deal with Fetter Baruch. But anyway, it's better because I think the way they pronounce Berg is much more of a sound to it also. So the story goes is that he was a very big critic of the Shmuel Zayden, and so he asked. So one Shabbos, there was like a new person that would come to see. All the Chassidim gather, and he asks, "Does anyone have any good lashon hara to say about the Shmuel Zayden?" And there's this guy. I know something. I was like, and was just shut up. This is not. Don't just don't. So the next that was the Friday night meal, Shabbos day meal, the whole kitchen. And it says, "So does anyone have any good lashon hara to say about the Shmuel Zayden?" I know. Be quiet. Don't trust us. Don't. And
why is he inciting us?
I told you, it's a totally different way of being. It's the way it was. And Baruch Mezhebush so comes to Shal Shudas, and it's getting late, and he's asking again, does anyone know before Shabbos any good lashon hara about the Shmuel Zayden? And eventually the person says, I know. I think he's going to yes. He says, yes, tell us. And he says, I was by the Shmuel Zayden. Now, because I didn't prepare the story, so I don't remember the details, but he said something weird about the Shmuel Zayden. Did this, and the whole thing is so weird. And he whatever whole story it was, he said how weird it was. Because the Shmuel Zayden had told him weird things in a way that seems halachically questionable in the middle of like davening. I don't remember what it was exactly. And so he's waiting for Baruch Mezhebush to be so grateful that he now has this good lashon hara. Baruch Mezhebush says to him, don't you think that someone who does X, Y, and Z, whatever, and X, Y, and Z was some like serious severity that this person did, should be told whatever the Shmuel Zayden told him? Basically, I don't remember the details, but what the Shmuel Zayden, what Baruch Mezhebush told him is, the Shmuel Zayden told you something in a very nice, subtle way that you've done a serious severity and needed to return to God. And you, instead of that, what did you do? You turned it into how the Shmuel Zayd is weird and doesn't know what he's doing, and he's like doing things that are questionable. You turned his subtle rebuke into a criticism of him. So I have now set you up to publicly humiliate yourself, and now you've revealed the Avera publicly, and now you'll do tshuva. That was Baruch Hashem. He didn't say those words, but that's what he did. So everyone's like, different kind of tzaddik.
And we just needed that.
How do you can work? I didn't get my tzaddik card, But yeah, you're right. I mean, this is. By the way, there's always a danger there of an imposter too. I mean, that's to be very honest, right? Just because somebody is acting this way, well, it's godly and it's a higher spiritual source. Like, okay, it's a fair question, and I don't have simple answers to that. But the point is, within ourselves, we can know we're not holy. So go back to right. It's not about you're bad, you're good. Just be honest, right? Like, when I get up in the morning, very, very simple question. Be honest with me. Apparently, before we get to is it bad or is it not bad, let's just be honest. When I get up in the morning, okay, after I'm dressed, so let's at least give me the credit of like I got my mind together. Do I feel like I want to say the morning blessings so that I can have my cup of coffee, or do I feel like I want to say the morning blessings because I want to encounter God? Like, what's my basic sense of? And, well, that already says something about me, doesn't it, right? So it's really amazing. So you're telling myself that I'm holy when I'm not, that doesn't accomplish anything, right? And now we're going further, right? Pretending that if I can just act holy, I'll somehow become actually, no, you're not holy. Okay, fine. It's like, is it helpful to tell a person, is it helpful to tell a blind person that they're not really blind?
No. Not, we have to be true. We have to be honest with ourselves.
Be honest. Okay, now, the problem is we're so busy judging, right? Putting good, bad labels on everything that we're too afraid to be honest, right?
But also, people are raised with different connotations of what they want to be.
True, right? And again, I don't mean to say that you're not holy if you take the word and put it in a different context. If you put the word in the context of, the Jewish people are God's people, and that creates a kind of holiness that they have relative to the Gentiles, and yes, we're holy, right? If you speak about the godly spark that underlies the essence of the soul, yes, that is holy. But when that is revealed, you'll see that you're totally a different person altogether, right? I'm not saying that holiness is not relevant to us. We do holy things. Holiness rests upon us when we enter into mitzvahs, we'll discuss later on, right? But I, as a human being living in this world, right, is holiness something that accurately characterizes who I am as a human being? And the answer is, well, to be honest, what would it mean to be holy? It would mean to be separate in a way that you're, again, existentially separate. You don't have to protect yourself from being corrupted and contaminated. And that's just not true. It's not true of me, and I doubt it's true of any of us in this room. It's not true of most people, and right? And okay, so there is this idea of the total transformation of the animal soul, and when that happens, then a person can be described as holy. And okay, fine. And I can ask why did God not let me transform an animal soul in that way? And we can discuss that in chapter 35. It's a fair question. But lying and pretending is not the case. And then is what I'm saying going further is, okay, and then saying, well, there's a part of me which is holy because I like to believe that because I read it in a book is not the most effective way to go. Is I'm saying, no, I have a sense of the value of holiness that comes from my godly soul and that I've developed and I've reflected and I've heard about it and it's meaningful to me. And okay, and I recognize that I may not be holy, but I can still act that way. And there's value in that. And now says that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to act holy, specifically when one is not holy. Right? That's what he says. The mitzvah is viskadishta. Make yourselves be holy. Right? Act in a way of holiness. I want to say something which relates to this topic. In general, one of the things that's very, very difficult on our minds, Chassidus, specifically Tanya, is that when a person is looking for affirmation, it is very hard to relate to the truth of things. Okay, so I'm going to give a totally different example. Okay, God willing, you will get married, yes? Okay. Will there be things that you seriously need to improve on as a wife and as a mother? Right, that's not unique to women, right? The same thing is true, right? About men, right? There's things that they will, whoever you marry, there's things that he's going to need to improve on as a husband, as a father, right? Okay. Do you want to be able to have conversations about that? Yeah? So what's going to have to not be part of the discussion? If you're going to stand in judgment that you're somehow less, or your husband is somehow less, because he has what to work on, you have what to work on as a husband, as a wife, as a mother, as a father, are you going to be able to have discussions about those things? No. So you have to be able to, yes, have discussions about the way things are, and also, right, so accept the way things are, and also have to bring your values into it at the same time, right? It needs to be the way things are and the values, and now we can think about how we're going to do, right? That's the triad. The way I am, what I value, what I'm going to do. But if I can't talk about the way I am, right, because I feel defensive, I can't hear that things need to be improved on because I'm defensive, right? I want to always see myself as the good, the perfect, the ideal, right? Then that introduces falsehood into the whole thing. And in a certain sense, that's what makes a relationship intimate. And I don't mean necessarily in the sense of husbands and wives. It can be intimate in the sense of friends, right? What makes a relationship intimate is that you can talk honestly about the way you are, even though it does not conform to your values, right? And that's what actually gives us the strength to then act in a way that conforms to our values. Otherwise, we're kind of lying to ourselves, and then our relationships are built around lies. And it's something that all people struggle with, and not all people, most people struggle with this, but it's important to be honest about that, right? And so the way the Alter Rebbe writes Tanya is he's kind of having that conversation with the person. Which is why, I could take out a select line here, a select line there that's very motivating, very inspiring, we're so holy, we're so right. But that's not really the tone of the book. The tone of the book is not really supposed to be motivating and inspiring. It's supposed to be honest. And honest is empowering, and honest is humbling. Those two things go together.
So if you are in a place of insecurity, you can't really be honest.
Correct. Think about that, right? In your own experience, think about that, right? When you're insecure.
What if you're being honest about your insecurities?
Okay, so that's the thing is, in real life, everything comes in degrees and levels. If you're really insecure, you can't even be honest that you're insecure, and you need someone to actually take initiative, right? If you're a little bit more so you can be secure, that you don't feel secure enough, right? You can say, and by the way, in a friendship, in a marriage, you can say, look, I'm not in a place where I can hear criticism right now. That's it, right? But that itself is a certain level of honesty and humility, and also, right? Okay.
Yeah. To be truly honest.
Right, and so that's it. When the Tanya was printed, the story goes that the Russian censor had to look it over before it was published. And he was asked what he thought of the Tanya. He said the Tanya took the fool out of the world. Right? The idea that people fool themselves, that's how it's written. And so, I'm not holy. And it's not, I don't know if I'm going to teach these parts because I'm debating about it, because this is hard enough. When it gets to chapters 29 and 30, it gets really hard. So Alter Rebbe really lays into the full picture of how lowly a person truly is.
What's an example?
What he says? He
Just
says,
one example.
He says, the very fact that it is a conceivable part of your psyche that you could sin shows that you are worse than the most demonic forces in existence, because they would never disobey God, and you would, under the right conditions.
But he didn't sin at all.
Alter Rebbe, no. There's a context in which he's saying. He's not saying just to berate the person. There's a context in which it's being said. But it's hard stuff.
Right, so it's you really can't learn the Tanya if you're not secure in yourself and who you are.
Well, this actually gets to another point that it's really important. And here I mean this on a perfectly completely human level, nothing to do with spirituality. It's very hard to learn Chabad Chassidus without a Rebbe, and I don't mean this in the spiritual sense. Simply because if you don't have a sense of who the person is saying the stuff, it's very easy to put it out of take it out of context, right? If you have a loving grandmother, right, and she wrote you a letter, and in the letter was some very hard to hear criticism, you would take it very differently, right, than if you saw a Facebook post by some anonymous person with the exact same words, right? Right? So if a person doesn't have a sense of who this person is and what their motivation is and what their interest is in telling you this, right, you take it very differently. Now, we didn't meet the Alter Rebbe, but we do have, stories about the kind of person he was, and we do have living recollections of the Rebbe, and still a few people left over, probably more who remember the Friedrich Rebbe. And there's a level of continuity between them on the level of, like, not necessarily the specifics of their personality, but the general kind of attitude towards people, towards Jews, and towards things. And again, these are important. In a certain sense, that's why traditionally Chassidus would start with telling stories. And then, this is what Hashem does also, right? He starts off with stories, right? Stories about his relationship with humanity, relationship with the forefathers, right? The Exodus, giving the Torah. And then he gets into, like, all, we do this and do that, right? And when Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Torah at Sinai, before the whole thing, right, he reads them over, all those stories, and says, okay, now do you want to enter into a relationship? You want to cover. So this idea is important. It's not always easy to replicate in a class, I'll grant you. But yeah, for sure, and it goes back to, like, in a marriage or a friendship, right? If you have that kind of trust and you have that kind of sense of who the person is, one of the key things in marriage especially, as a general rule, barring, like, serious breakdown, what one spouse says is never meant to attack the other spouse. Well, now, sometimes that's actually consciously true, even though it might not feel that way, and sometimes that's not consciously true. It's only unconsciously true. Which then sometimes the spouse feels so defensive and so hurt, right, that they're trying to defend themselves, and they do so by lashing out the other spouse. But even that is really coming from that they feel defensive, they feel isolated, right, and they actually, right. So if both spouses keep that in mind, that no one really wants, right, not really want to antagonize the other and downplay the other, then that helps, right? But you have that context. And that's why having positive interaction is very important in a relationship with parents and children. And it's a hard things to do. So, yeah, Rabbi Kaufmann comes in and teaches you 3 times a week and says you're not a holy person. You can feel very insulted, right? I agree with you. But if we can take a step out of how the words make us feel and say, well, what are we saying by those words? And how that's actually empowering. Because it's saying, okay, instead of trying to make it that I have to be a certain way, for my to be authentic, I can actually free myself from that and say, okay, what about my values, right? Like, think about how imprisoning it is for a person to say, well, that's just the way I am. As opposed to say, I might not be this way, but I value it. It's important to me. So I'm going to do what I can to. Right? And so that's what he's now taking into the realm of holiness. Before it was the realm of sinning versus not sinning. And now he's taking it all the way into the realm of holiness, right? And just because you're not holy doesn't mean you have to act and engage the world in an unholy way. You can engage the world in an unholy way, even though there's an element of artificialness in the sense that it's a conscious decision to act on your values rather than a natural expression of the kind of person you are. And that comes back to I have to actually evaluate that. If I don't value it, I won't be able to do it. Make sense? Okay. One other thing, the Baal Shem Tov, heard of the Baal Shem Tov? The Baal Shem Tov exuded what above all else in relation to other people? Love. Okay? And Chassidus, in all of its forms, is perpetuation of the Baal Shem Tov, right? Okay. Right. And so Chabad is all about the Baal Shem Tov. Okay. At the end of the Shavuos night, we read the Tikkun. So at the end of it, there's different things. One of these is the Zohar, a certain section of the Zohar. So there's the end of it. At the end there is literally how the Tikkun ends. This Chabad version, the Ashkenazi version, the Sephardic version. But the Tikkun there. So Rabbi Shimon is at the end of his life, and he's debating whether to reveal this secret. He says, "Woe to me if I reveal it, and woe to me if I don't reveal it." He's back and forth and back and forth. And in the end, he decides he's going to reveal the secret. And what's the big secret? Anon chavivus Italian Musa. We depend on love. As the pasuk says, Ahavti es Amar Hashem. I loved you, said Hashem. Ahavti Hashem eschem. Hashem did this out of His love for you. Ahavti Hashem lekech. You should love Hashem. Right? You should love Hashem. Right? It's all there's a love as a grounding thing. Now the thing is, right, love is wonderful. Love is amazing. But love, life does not make on its own. Love requires us to engage with reality and deal with the reality based on love, in the context of love. And so we have to just keep that in mind when we're doing things like, here, if you can get to chapters 29 and 30, right? There's why we have an expression like tough love.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you love people and you tell them things that are hard to hear, but they need to hear, right? And the goal is, again, to help them be ultimately more authentic, right? The Alter is not saying be less authentic. He's saying be authentic. Just realize there's it's not just how you are and what kind of being you are and how you act. There's also this third element, what you value.
So who are we at our core? Because
I'll tell you like this. It's a silly question. It's a silly question. I think it's a silly question.
Because there's some teachers that's like would focus on like at our core where our God is soul, and our God is soul is like pure and
You know when that is a good thing to think? I'm not saying here's the thing. Who am I at my core is a very valid question in a specific context. And if it's in a specific context, it will have different answers. When I wake up in the morning, you know who you should say who I am at my core? Is my godly soul. And my godly soul is pure. You know why I should say that? Even though the sages put it there, but why should I say that? Well, number one, if I wake up in the morning and I feel icky because I did things yesterday I shouldn't have done, how do you think that that's going to go into my decision-making process going forward the rest of the day, next day? Not good. On the other hand, if I say, look, whatever happened, and I'm not saying there's no consequences, but at my core, there is a clean place to work from. That's extremely empowering in the beginning of the day, right?
and at other times when you're
Okay, and any similar types of situations, right? Those are valuable ways to think about yourself. On the other hand, when I'm feeling very satisfied with myself, which is the context of chapters 29 and 30, right? And that closes me off to genuine intimacy, genuine openness, genuine vulnerability with God, right? Well, then I probably should think that at my core, I'm actually probably not nearly as accomplished as I thought. In fact, on a certain level, on a fundamental level, I haven't progressed beyond the most debased parts of myself because they're still there, and then being just keeping them in check. And that's also true, right? You know, when I think about, you know, when I think about living life for the most part, worrying about who I am at my core is probably just a distraction. I should focus more on what my values are and what I can do to pursue them, right? You see what I'm saying? Like, in the abstract, it's like a silly question because it's like, I'll give you another example. It's a silly question, yeah. What's this? It's a silly question. You want to say silly question? It has infinite answers. You need a context. Is it a cup? Is it plastic? Is it a collapsed quantum wave function? Is it the expression of industry? Like, there's so many ways you can answer the question, right? If you don't have a context. Now, I agree with you that, generally speaking, in the everyday context, we relate to it first and foremost by its function. So we call it a cup, which is fine, right? Right? But, you know, if someone takes this to a lab and asks you what is it, you say it's a cup, they just look at you annoyed. Like, that's not, like, clearly, in this context, I want to know, like, what its chemical composition is. See what I'm saying? Like, having this, but I need one answer. It's like, no. Ask yourself in context, is this a helpful question? If it is, what would be the helpful way of answering it? It should be a true answer, but it doesn't make it the ultimate answer. So yes, what other teachers tell you is for sure valid, for sure, and has a context. Again, that bracha we say every morning is a place where that context is very important, right? And the Alter Rebbe actually does speak about that idea in a different chapter of time, but, you know, in other contexts. And most of the time, focusing on our values and what we can do to perpetuate them, move them along, is probably much more important than focusing on what am I really.